you think about the diversity of our student body. Our student body is more diverse than our faculty and staff. I mean, should that be perfectly aligned, or what is there a goal here?
I think the goal is, if you try and just quantify it, you can have equal fractions, but that's only part of the solution. It's not, you have to have the real interactions that I talked about and the sensitivity to look at the differences, but also appreciate the similarities. So it's really not just bringing in numbers, it's got to be the quality of the experience. If it's quality experience, we retain more minority faculty. And then as they interact with majority faculty, then they get to know one another and realize that I think we're all looking for the same things in life.
Right.
And then we bring different perspectives. And so if, for example, if I had dreadlocks, right? Okay, I may be perceived differently than I don't have any hair now, right? But someone can then talk about the history behind dreadlocks, you know, and the religious component out of the Caribbean. So those type different perspectives can come together and really explain some of the appearances that we tend to utilize to stereotype each other.
So permission to have an honest and direct conversation with colleagues.
Exactly, yes.
And almost permission to have conversations with students.
Yes.
As well, and helping students even have that conversation with each other, even though they may have different backgrounds.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Because I am reminded, in some ways, we both grew up in small towns. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. You grew up in a small town in Mississippi. And there are probably elements of that are somewhat similar.
Exactly.
In a small town. But there's elements that were quite different, obviously because of race.
Yes.
But also northern, southern cultures are different as well. And I guess where I'm going on this is I just think of the conversations that you and I have had. While it's interesting to compare notes in terms of what makes us similar, I learn a lot more when I talk about and learn about differences as well, right?
Yes.
So how do you balance this idea of recognizing that there is a lot that makes us the same and acknowledging that, not forgetting that, because we're humans, we're, you know, at the basic level, we're all hopefully striving for some, you know, similar kinds of things that humans do, but there are those differences in our experience and backgrounds that have led us potentially to learn from each other. How do you balance those two things?
It varies from one day to the next. I'll just chime in here and say that I always talk about the similarities first, because if you look at the differences first, then we tend to value one another at different levels. But if you look at the similarities first, then we will value each other. And then those differences become learning experiences versus a way to divide us and say, no, one's better than the other. So I think that's why I always focus on
the similarities. That again. So similarities, this idea of if you first focus on similarities, you've leveled the playing field.
Yes, yes.
Because this is how we are the same.
Exactly.
And then the differences allow us to accentuate then those areas where we can learn.
Exactly, yes.
That's a great way to think of that, I think.
I'll add to this in that when you look at the similarities as well as then you start talking about the differences, and there's this concept of unconscious bias, then you can break down those unconscious biases, because now we realize that what I thought was happening really is not happening. It was just a difference that we had in our experiences of how we interpret things.
But if something's unconscious, how will any of us recognize if it's unconscious?
You bring it to the surface.
So how do I bring it, if I don't know?
Through conversation. That's how it happens, yeah.
So you would tell me?
In some cases, yeah. In some cases, you'll realize it yourself.
No, but would you, if you and I were interacting, you would tell me, right?
Yes, yes.
So we should expect that as colleagues of each other, right?
Yes.
That, and I would hope across the university, if
Yes.
to at least raise those. Okay, so this idea of unconscious bias is real.
Yes. We all have filters. And those filters prevent us from seeing things from another person's perspective. So another analogy, if you want to use physics as an analogy, we are actually unclouding or removing the filter as we learn more about one another. We become more transparent.
Right. What advice would you have? Advice you would have for search committees, whether it be for faculty or staff? If you know, as we're trying to diversify our faculty staff and retain those faculty and staff and ensure that they're having a great career here at Bowling Green, you know, it begins by the search committee. That's where it all starts, right? Well, have you, in your experience, have you seen some situations where that you'd say, oh, here's some advice I would give that search committee?
Advice to search committees. One is to don't be passive. What I mean by that is that we tend to put ads out, and we'll say we'll put them in certain locations or publications where we're targeting faculty of color, and we just wait for applications to come in. Well, organizations who are successful, they're proactive. They will actually look for people who will help the organization. Mm-hmm. So we need to be proactive versus passive or reactive, and building the pool. Okay. The other thing is do some self-reflection in that, what is the goal of the search? Is it just to bring someone in who's been doing what we've always done? Or do we want a different perspective? And have that conversation on the front end, okay? And realize that on the retention side, I mentioned the culture. What culture do we have in the department? Is it an inclusive culture or not inclusive culture? And you can get at that by just looking at how faculty come and go, not just minority faculty. If there's large turnover in a department, there's typically a cultural problem. Mm-hmm. But if you have stability, then you have culture, but it may not be the right culture you need to move forward, but at least there's stability there. Right. And so there's that happy medium where you're open to bringing new people in and thinking differently. And also I think about on the recruitment side, I think it starts prior to the search committee, because in many cases we think that we cannot get a minority faculty member to come to Northwest Ohio because we're in Northwest Ohio. Some minority faculty will not come to Northwest Ohio because it's Northwest Ohio, because of the stereotypes and the vision that each have of them. But if you can get people here to see what Northwest Ohio is all about, you can break down the stereotypes and the perceptions that one has, and you can get more applicants that way. Some of the examples would be visiting professorships and those type things by targeting minorities who would come in and say, well, BGSU is okay. It's not as bad as I thought it would be. Right. No, well, the winter is not as cold as we thought it would be.
We thought it would be, right.
Yes. So those are the type things you can do to be proactive in attracting minority faculty. Yes.
And then, you know, you mentioned about culture. It just seems to me the importance of making sure that you lead a little bit by, before the search even begins, reflecting as a department on what the culture of that department is, and are there perhaps even unbiased ways in which there are elements that even how a position is described could make it less than open, if you will.
Exactly, yes.
To have some new ideas, diversity of people to even apply.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We know the demographic change that is occurring throughout the United States, and you and I have chatted about this a little bit, but even when you begin to think about democracy,
yes,
and a democracy that in the U.S. at least, we have decided that we want to self-govern, and the citizens have a right to vote. And the challenge is, when this country was formed, it was a single sort of race country. It was white males were given the right to vote and no one else. And so it just seems to me what a challenge we have here in a world in which is in a country that's becoming more and more diverse with a lot of differing backgrounds and experiences. How do we make sure our democracy continues to be successful and or I should say becomes what it says it aspires to be, which is each individual has a right to be a part of this democracy. So, and it begins in higher ed, it seems to me, right? I mean, it starts here at maybe K through 12 is perhaps where it starts, and even before. But we have an opportunity here at Bowling Green to do so much more. It seems to me. You've been at some other institutions. I've been at some other institutions, but you've had more varied experience in terms of a diversity. As you mentioned, you were at North Carolina A&T and historically black college and university,
Yes.
HBCU, and now you're at a predominantly white institution. There are differences here, right?
Yeah,
I mean, but we're all trying to do the same thing.
Yes.
Educate future citizens and leaders of our country.
Correct, yes.
And of the world, of course. Yeah.
Right. I look at it as a national security issue.
Tell me more about that.
Okay, well, if you think about, I talked about I was one of the few Americans in the STEM area in physics at Kent State, and this is back in the 80s. Well, we basically outsourced our research and development by relying on foreign nationals to populate STEM areas versus investing in our K-12 systems and higher ed, where we have more Americans going into STEM areas. But if you look at the history of innovation in the US, it really started after World War II with the influx of scientists from Europe, specifically Germany. Okay, and we rode that wave through the 60s through Apollo program and landing on the moon. And then we de-emphasized science, engineering, and mathematics.
Right.
And we started importing goods and products versus producing them here. So if we, some people will say that military might will not be what determines who's in power in the world in the future. It's going to be economic might. And if we are having to import things and have things built in other countries, and we don't have the science that's ongoing that will develop the technology, okay, that we take for granted, then it's a security issue because we won't be able to support ourselves. And we've seen examples of that in recent years, even with the COVID situation, when people couldn't travel, goods couldn't move because of people couldn't fly, and so on and so forth. We have supply chain issues. So it's a national security issue that we invest in our resources. And I'll make the analogy that we have a team that's diverse in terms of the population, but if we don't fully embrace 1/3 or half of the team, then we're in the game, we're shorthanded.
Right.
So how can we compete with other countries who have the full team on the playing field and we only have half a team on the playing field?
Right.
And that's why it's really important that we all embrace diversity, because we're in this together and we have to work together in order to be successful in this world.
And you know, think of the demographics moving forward. That team will need to become much more diverse. It's just when we look at the population of the United States, right? It is becoming more diverse every day. And that we know isn't going to change because who's being born today will influence who's off to college in 18 years and then off into the workforce and doing the research and thinking about the country continuing to thrive and be strong. It is important that we do our part here at Bowling Green, that we, regardless of an individual's background, they've got opportunities here to be successful and learn from each other.
Exactly.
And people that look like me, we need to make sure that we understand how we interact and and making sure that we are learning from people, whatever their background is, because each of us have, I believe, something to bring to the table.
Right.
And sometimes you've got to empower people, give them permission to share that at times even.
Yes.
But how do we keep that dialogue moving? I think that's our key. We have to keep. I think a lot of people were awakened with the George Floyd killing.
Yes.
But this is incidences like this has happened before. But this time, I sure hope our conversations continue and we stay committed. And so it's not a moment in time, but it is a movement, if you will, that we can truly begin to evolve and become the kind of institution that we aspire to be.
Yes, yes, I agree. And in interacting with some of the Black alumni from the late 60s and hearing their stories of the experiences here at Bowling Green, it has made differences in lives, and we can do much more if we work even closer together.
Yeah.
To move everybody forward, because again, we stand together, divided, we'll fall.
We
We'll
fall.
Yeah.
Right. Power of working together, learning from each other, respecting each other, but valuing each of the people in our community. So.
Yes.
All right. Thanks for the conversation.
Sure. Thank you.